Tonight, border showdown. When a bipartisan Senate immigration bill in the works could be heading to the United States House of Representatives.
We are experiencing an invasion at the southern border.
Even as congressional Republicans prepare to impeach the Secretary of Homeland Security.
Policy differences are not impeachable.
Plus, a United Nations humanitarian aid organization accused of aiding terrorism.
UNRA is an organization of the United Nations that is a complete cover-up for Hamas activities.
And combating global religious persecution.
Religious freedom is seen as an existential threat.
All this and more tonight on Faith Nation. With a looming battle over a Senate immigration deal, House Republicans target a top Biden cabinet official over the border. Good evening. I'm John Jessup in Washington. Welcome to Faith Nation. Well, immigration dominating conversations across Capitol Hill today. Ahead of a key committee vote to impeach him, Homeland Security Secretary Alejandro Mayorkas called the move baseless, while another House committee investigated individual states' authority to secure the southern border. And over in the Democrat-controlled Senate, negotiators are closing in on a bipartisan immigration bill, setting the stage with a showdown with the GOP-controlled House. CBN national security correspondent Burke helps us break it all down. Caitlin, can we start with those articles of impeachment against the Homeland Security Secretary?
John, Mayorkas faces charges of refusing to uphold the law and breaching the public trust in his handling of the U.S. southern border. Republicans continuing to push forward in spite of significant Democrat opposition.
If your refusal to obey the law leads to the death of your fellow Americans, you no longer deserve to keep your job. You're breaking the people's trust.
The last cabinet member impeached came in 1876 under President Ulysses S. Grant. Corruption charges led to that outcome, and Democrats maintain this attempt is over a policy dispute.
In a process akin to throwing spaghetti at the wall and seeing what sticks, Republicans have cooked up vague, unprecedented grounds to impeach Secretary Mayorkas.
In a new letter to the Homeland Security Committee, Mayorkas writes that the false accusations do not rattle or divert him. Democrats call the impeachment effort a sham, accusing House Republicans of following the wishes of former President Donald Trump.
Extreme MAGA Republicans who are running the House of Representatives are deeply unserious people. They don't want progress. They don't want solutions. They want a political issue. And most of all, they want to please their disgraced former president.
Trump wants Republicans to oppose an expected bipartisan immigration bill in the Senate, saying it would be a gift to Democrats and legislative victory for President Biden. A Senate vote could come as early as next week. GOP negotiators expressing frustration over claims it will be dead on arrival in the House.
We want a change in law. And now it's interesting, a few months later, when we're finally getting to the end, they're like, oh, just kidding. I actually don't want a change in law because it's a presidential election year.
Meanwhile, another House committee today considering the authority of states to unilaterally take action to secure the southern border if the federal government fails to do so.
As Thomas Jefferson put it, self-preservation is paramount to all law. The fact of the matter is, of course, the people of Texas have a right to defend themselves, just as I have a right to defend my home and my family if it is under attack.
Federal law governing immigration is the supreme law of the land. We cannot have 50 different sets of immigration laws. Attempts by the states to enact and implement their own immigration enforcement policies that conflict with federal law are clearly unconstitutional.
Democrats say if Republicans are serious about improving the situation at the border, they should pass legislation providing the funding to do so. When it comes to the articles of impeachment against Secretary Mayorkas, a full House vote could come as early as next week. John?
Caitlin, I was reading earlier, constitutional scholars and a former Homeland Security Secretary under George Bush said that nothing Mayorkas has done constitutes an impeachable offense, although that's where it looks like things are headed. So what happens if the full vote goes to the House?
That's right, John. They would then be sent to the Democrat-controlled Senate, where they're pretty much guaranteed to fall apart. Still, if they pass the House, it forces an election year impeachment trial, where Republicans will make their case against Mayorkas, which also winds up being an indictment of President Biden's immigration policies. John?
All right, National Security Correspondent Caitlin Burke. Thanks so much, Caitlin. Well, also on Capitol Hill today, an attempt to expose links to terror groups within a United Nations humanitarian aid organization. That was the focus of a House Foreign Affairs Committee after the United States temporarily halted funding to the UN Relief and Works Agency for Palestine refugees over alleged involvement in the October 7th terror attacks. Lawmakers on both sides of the aisle calling for accountability.
There has been long been a massive and irrefutable evidence of UNRWA's extensive complicity and cooperation in Hamas's anti-Semitic, genocidal hate campaign.
How do we ensure that the innocent civilian population of Gaza that is facing famine does not pay an even steeper price in human life because of the actions of 12 horrific individuals?
Meanwhile, the Israeli government is calling for a dismantling of UNRWA or a complete rebuild from the ground up, accusing the UN agency of using American tax dollars to fuel hatred and terror against the Jewish state. CBN Middle East correspondent Julie Stahl has that story from Jerusalem.
Things must change, and it starts with UNRWA.
Knesset member Sharon Haskell created the caucus to reform UNRWA 9 years ago.
UNRWA is an organization of the United Nations that is a complete cover-up for Hamas activities. They are inciting and educating children to violence and hatred.
In caring for so-called Palestinian refugees living in the West Bank and Gaza Strip as well as nearby countries, UNRWA's website says its services include primary and vocational education, primary health care, relief and social services, and camp improvement.
We need to understand that UNRWA is not an organization that provides education and welfare and health care. That's merely the facade. It's an organization that has two deep roles: to ensure that the conflict from 1948 remains an open case, and therefore that there is a permanent question mark on Israel's very existence, creating a generation after generation of Palestinians who believe that one day Israel will not exist.
Dr. Anat Wilf adds, UNRWA relieves Hamas of any humanitarian responsibility, a philosophy confirmed by senior Hamas member Musa Abu Marzouk, who said, these tunnels are meant to protect Hamas from Israeli planes, and it's the responsibility of the UN to protect the people.
There's a generation that does not know that UNRWA was started in order to undermine the state of Israel. Count Falk Bernadotte, who was the first UN mediator, he was upset with the right of the law of return.
That law allows Jews worldwide to immigrate to Israel.
So he said the Palestinians have to have the right of return, and their inalienable right to go back to where they came from in '48, instead of being, absorbed like any other refugee.
David Bedin started Israel Behind the News to expose teachings and practices going on inside UN facilities in Gaza and the West Bank.
We have been through 1,000 school books used by the Palestinian Authority at UNRWA. We were offered by a prominent rabbi $10,000 for a research grant to find anything for peace. I said, look, I'd like to have your money, but it doesn't exist. It is one system, not for hatred, but for murder.
Knesset member Simcha Rotman says UNRWA funding needs to stop.
So the fact that UNRWA gets money as a donation, and this money supports terror, actively supports terror, needs to stop. There is no excuse for educating for terror. There is no excuse for facilitating the next October 7th.
Wilf says, unfortunately, Israel cooperated with UNRWA for years, thinking it was a moderating force.
Israel has to do a 180 and declare quite clearly that it will no longer cooperate with UNRWA. UNRWA provides no benefit, and no country that is a friend of Israel should give any money to UNRWA.
The United Nations is a hornet's nest of Jew hatred, is a hornet's nest of deception, is a hornet's nest of terror-supporting policies and organizations.
Dan Diker of the Jerusalem Center for Public Affairs says Gaza has become a forward base for the Iranian regime.
Today, it's the Iranian regime that is mobilizing UNRWA with its Hamas proxy to incite to the murdering of Jews and Israelis, to carry out acts of terror. They have sanctified as a strategic objective the destruction of Israel from within UNRWA compounds and organizations within Gaza.
Diker believes the U.S. should lead an international body to supervise UNRWA donations until it can be dissolved and responsibility given to local Palestinians. Julie Stahl, CBN News, Jerusalem.
All right, thank you, Julie. Well, after weighing his options, President Biden says he's decided how the United States will respond to the drone attack that killed 3 American service members in Jordan. The incident fueling fears about a potential broader conflict in the Middle East. Iran says it was not involved in the deadly attack, the result of a reported mix-up over an enemy drone possibly mistaken for a U.S. aircraft. At the White House today, President Biden emphasized de-escalation.
I don't think we need a wider war in the Middle East. That's not what I'm looking for.
Rising tensions in the region come as surveillance video released by the Palestinian Authority shows Israeli forces disguised as hospital staff, one dressed as a doctor, another a Palestinian woman, infiltrating a hospital in the West Bank in a pre-dawn raid and assassinating a commander and 2 other members of Hamas. In Gaza, newly released Israeli army footage is said to show battles with Hamas in the southern city of Han Yunis. Addressing troops in the West Bank today, Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu vowed to press on, adding that 500 Hamas terrorists have been taken out so far this year. Hamas estimates 26,000 Palestinians have been killed. Meanwhile, Israel, Hamas, and other international mediators in the region continue to negotiate the release of hostages and a ceasefire in the war. Well, Netanyahu's top advisor, Ron Dermer, reportedly is set to visit the White House tomorrow to meet with senior administration officials at the White House for more talks. The fight for religious freedom takes center stage in the nation's capital. We head to the International Religious Freedom Summit when Faith Nation returns. Welcome back. In Washington this week, the fight against worldwide religious persecution is bringing people of all persuasions together. The unlikely allies meeting at the International Religious Freedom Summit, kicking off today to protect the right to worship freely.
Some of the people we have brought together, very progressive Democrats with very conservative, socially conservative Republicans. We have brought, for example, representatives from the American Atheists. It's really, in that sense, quite an inspiring movement and very much a positive counterpoint to all the division we face on so many fronts.
One of the summit's goals, to increase public awareness and political strength for the international religious freedom movement. And CBN senior international correspondent George Thomas is here in Washington for a change, covering the summit. He joins us now. George, great to see you. So this event is unique given that it brings together leaders and lawmakers from both sides of the aisle. George, why is religious freedom such a uniting cause?
Well, to the organizers of the International Religious Freedom Summit, they say 80% of the world's population faces some form of religious oppression, from 365 million Christians around the world who suffer for their faith, to the Uyghur Muslims in Xinjiang province in China, to the Buddhists of Thailand, to the Rohingya Muslims in Myanmar, to the Hindus and the Muslims and Christians in India, across the globe, be it in Nigeria, to Yemen, to Iran, to, you just name it, Saudi Arabia, China, people of faith around the world suffering for their faith. And so an opportunity to bring these various diverse groups of people of faith together in one place to talk about the plight that they face and the challenges they face, and to provide a sense of unity that you can work across different denominations, different faith groups for this one purpose, in order to allow themselves to continue to practice their faith in freedom as well as in safety.
While it is encouraging, George, to hear the bipartisan nature, this unity that is bringing people together, this year's meeting, though, comes at a time of high tension in the Middle East. George, what tone does that seem to set as the summit gets underway?
Yeah, it really does, does have that sense of, real sadness that this is taking place. I had a chance to talk to the IRF co-chair, Dr. Katrina Lantos-Sweat, who told me this morning, she's never seen in probably the last 40 years the level of anti-Semitism that is being expressed around the world, from the college campuses to the streets of London, to the streets of Tokyo, you name it. It's very, very alarming. What is interesting, though, in the various previous plenary sessions, I haven't seen much focus necessarily on the ongoing conflict between Israel and Hamas. Obviously, there's been some general talk about the ongoing challenges for people of faith in the Middle East, but not really so much focus on the ongoing conflict today that's happening in the Middle East.
George, in about the minute and a half that we have left, what are some of the biggest topics or themes that you're seeing at this year's summit and some of the conversations that you've been having?
Yeah, I think, we've been at CBN News covering this issue for, 30 plus years. And, it has dramatically changed the level of persecution, the kinds of persecution that is happening today. And today, the trends, the emerging trends is what's being discussed here. For example, the use of artificial intelligence to facial recognition. How does that impact a person's ability to practice his or her own faith in freedom as well as in protection? So they look at countries like China that have deployed unbelievable technology, for example, in the Xinjiang province to track the Uyghur Muslims. And then also the concern that this technology being produced and developed by the Chinese, then being exported to other autocratic dictatorial countries around again to be used for these and other purposes. And then the other thing is this whole rise of nationalism. And they point to countries like India, where there is this concept Hindutva, this Hindu nationalism that is rising, and other trends. Those are things that people are paying a lot of focus on as it relates to the to religious freedom and people's ability to practice in safe.
We're going to have to leave it there. Senior international correspondent George Thomas in Washington, D.C. for us. Thank you so much, George.
You're welcome.
One country bringing two top figures from two different administrations and political parties together for a word of cautionary warning. That story coming up. Two former CIA directors appointed by presidents from two different political parties in agreement tonight on China's role as a global threat. Former Secretary of State Mike Pompeo and former Defense Secretary Leon Panetta finding consensus on a common theme. Today's hearing over China's authoritarian alignment focused on Beijing's support for U.S. foes. American competition with China put the spotlight on the Chinese Communist Party's foreign policy and its relations with Iran and Russia.
This challenge is not remotely about politics. It is not remotely partisan. It is so much more fundamental than that.
We are facing an increasingly aligned group of autocrats around the world. And the fact is that they are now having dual-use technologies that are being spread with Russia, Iran, China, and North Korea.
The sweeping testimony from two of America's former top spy chiefs detailing dangers from China, from modernizing the military and expanding the nuclear arsenal to militarizing the South China Sea and conducting cyber hacking and disinformation campaigns. Well, Brian Burke is a senior policy advisor for China and the Indo-Pacific at the Heritage Foundation. He's here now for more. Brian, good to see you. So when you have two former CIA directors from two different administrations drawing attention to the same issue, it signals a major concern. Brian, my question for you is, though, are Americans taking that concern seriously?
We absolutely should take the China threat seriously.
Brian, I'm not sure if we have a delay.
Yeah, so I think that if you watch the China Select Committee hearing today, the two witnesses were in pretty remarkable agreement. Both spoke about the CCP's investment in American decline and how they've been at war with our economy for 20 to 40 years. And they also seem to agree on how the CCP sensed weakness and became more aggressive along with Russia. So it was a pretty concise masterclass in why we should be concerned about the Chinese threat.
As you study this issue, as you pay attention to what's going on in China, what areas of concern are the most, is what you look at most seriously?
Well, I mean, the CCP's primary objective under Xi Jinping is to dominate Asia. That's what we need to be the most concerned about. That's their first stepping stone on the road to retaking Taiwan and ultimately displacing the United States as the most powerful country on earth.
Brian, is China's influence, though, faltering at all in the wake of domestic problems, including a weak economy where foreign investors are now questioning whether China remains a stable market?
Well, I think that people are waking up to the threat. Clearly, you know, the game is up to an extent. I don't think anybody really believes that China is going to play a helpful role in vis-a-vis Iran and encouraging Iran to rein in its proxies, for example, despite the fact that the administration seems to think that that's a viable strategy. So people are waking up, but we also need to get more serious. I think that, you know, there's still a tendency in the business community, for example, to think that it's possible to work with the CCP as a useful partner. There's a tendency in certain areas of the administration to try to do a diplomatic approach to the PRC when it's become clear for some time that they really respond to strength.
Do you think there's enough political will to take on the challenge of China?
I think we're getting there. You know, I think that it's difficult to say, given the current environment we're in. We have a proliferating amount of contingencies around the world, and we're really at an important moment where we need to make some tough decisions. Can we actually direct the resources and prioritization that we need to direct towards Asia to handle the security threats that we need to handle? Can we rein in the forces here at home who are still profiting alongside the Chinese Communist Party? We're starting to make improvements, but we have a lot more work to do.
All right, Brian Burke with the Heritage Foundation, thank you so much for your time and your expertise tonight. Coming up, a veteran's lifetime of service bringing history to life for younger generations. And finally tonight, a World War II veteran is making history come alive for future generations. 98-year-old Arthur Grubener has his service to the country didn't end with the close of the war. Arthur became a Navy man back in 1944, proudly giving back to his country. Now, 80 years later, Arthur continues to serve, volunteering on a ship similar to the one he once called home. Arthur teaches younger generations about the USS Intrepid, which sits in New York City's Hudson River.
I figure it's a duty that I owe this generation.
A duty that he's been doing for decades now, speaking at classrooms and academies, military academies that is, all over the country, and we appreciate his service and salute him tonight. Thank you so much for joining us. We hope to see you again tomorrow.